What happens when the powerful need someone to blame? When justice becomes a tool of oppression? This is the story of a young man whose life was destroyed to protect the reputation of those who held his chains. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful historical stories that reveal the hidden truths of the past. The Georgia sun beat mercilessly on the cotton fields of Whitmore Plantation in the summer of 1847. Among the rows of white bowls, 18-year-old Samuel worked with the quiet efficiency that had kept him alive for as long as he could remember. His hands, calloused from years of labor, moved with practiced precision as he filled his sack, the weight growing heavier with each passing hour. Samuel was different from the other enslaved workers, though he tried desperately not to show it. His mother, before her death when he was 12, had secretly taught him to read using discarded newspapers and torn book pages she'd salvaged from the big house. "Knowledge is the only thing they can't take from you," she'd whispered during those clandestine lessons by candlelight, "but never let them know you have it." The Whitmore estate was one of the largest in Hancock County, owned by Judge Cornelius Whitmore, a man whose word carried the weight of law throughout the region. The judge was a tall, imposing figure, with steel-gray hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to see through everyone around him. He had built his reputation on being tough but fair, a pillar of Southern society, who commanded respect from both his peers and his property. His wife, Margaret Whitmore, was 28 years old and had been married to the judge for 8 years. She was a woman of delicate beauty, with auburn hair that caught the light like burnished copper, and green eyes that held depths of loneliness that few ever noticed. Margaret had been raised in Charleston society, educated in literature and music, but found herself isolated on the plantation with little intellectual stimulation and a husband 20 years her senior, who viewed her more as an ornament than a companion. The plantation house stood like a white monument to power and privilege, its tall columns and wraparound porches speaking of wealth built on the backs of human bondage. Inside, the rooms were filled with fine furniture imported from Europe, crystal chandeliers, and portraits of stern-faced ancestors who had established the family fortune generations ago. Samuel's quarters were in the slave cabins behind the main house, simple wooden structures that housed the plantation's workforce. He shared his small space with 2 other young men, but he often found himself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling and wondering what lay beyond the boundaries of Whitmore land. It was on a particularly hot afternoon in July that Samuel's life began its tragic trajectory toward destruction. He had been assigned to help with repairs to the main house's library, a room lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes that represented more knowledge than Samuel had ever imagined could exist in one place. As he worked to fix a loose floorboard, Margaret Whitmore entered the room. She moved with the grace of someone accustomed to fine things, her pale blue dress rustling softly as she approached the shelves. Samuel immediately lowered his eyes, as was expected, but not before he caught sight of the book in her hands, a volume of poetry by Lord Byron. "You may continue your work," she said softly, her voice carrying the refined accent of Charleston society. "I'll just be reading quietly." Samuel nodded and returned to his task, but he found his concentration broken by the sound of her voice as she read aloud softly, almost to herself. The words were beautiful, speaking of love and longing in ways that stirred something deep within him. He had never heard poetry recited with such feeling, such understanding of the emotions behind the words. "She walks in beauty, like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies." Margaret's voice drifted across the room, and Samuel found himself pausing in his work, captivated despite himself. When she finished the passage, there was silence. Samuel realized he had stopped working entirely and was listening with rapt attention. Quickly, he bent back to his task, hoping she hadn't noticed. "Do you know that poem?" Margaret asked suddenly. Samuel's heart raced. He should say no, should maintain the facade of ignorance that kept enslaved people safe. But something in her tone, a genuine curiosity rather than suspicion, made him hesitate. "No, ma'am," he replied carefully, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret studied him for a moment, and Samuel felt as though she could see right through his lie. There was an intelligence in her eyes that made him uncomfortable, as if she understood more about the world than her sheltered life should have allowed. "It's Byron," she said finally. one of the greatest poets of our time. He understood that beauty and darkness often walk hand in hand. Samuel nodded politely and tried to focus on his work, but he could feel her watching him. The afternoon stretched on in this strange tension, with Margaret reading quietly, and Samuel acutely aware of every sound she made, every rustle of her dress, every soft sigh as she turned the pages. When he finished his work and gathered his tools, Margaret spoke again. "The floorboard sounds much better now. Thank you for your careful work." "Yes, ma'am," Samuel replied, still not meeting her eyes. As he reached the door, she called out once more, "Samuel, isn't it?" He turned, surprised that she knew his name. "Yes, ma'am." "You have very gentle hands for such demanding work. I imagine you could handle delicate tasks quite well." There was something in her tone that made Samuel's chest tighten, with an emotion he couldn't name. He nodded quickly and escaped from the room, his heart pounding as he made his way back to the safety of the fields. That night, as he lay in his narrow bunk, Samuel couldn't shake the memory of Margaret's voice reading poetry, or the way she had looked at him as if she saw something more than just another piece of property. He told himself it meant nothing, that he was reading too much into a simple conversation. But deep down, he knew that something had shifted that afternoon, something that would prove impossible to undo. The next few weeks passed in a blur of routine work, but Samuel found himself assigned to tasks around the main house more frequently. Whether this was coincidence or design, he couldn't say, but he began to notice Margaret watching him from windows or doorways as he worked in the gardens or repaired shutters. Their conversations, when they occurred, were always brief and seemingly innocent. She might comment on the weather or ask about his progress on a particular task. But there was an undercurrent to these exchanges, a tension that Samuel felt but couldn't understand. One evening in late August, as Samuel was finishing his work in the rose garden beneath Margaret's bedroom window, she appeared on the balcony above. The setting sun cast a golden glow over everything, and she looked like something from one of the paintings in the main house. "The roses are beautiful this year," she said, her voice drifting down to him. "Yes, ma'am. The rain's been good to them." "Do you have a favorite?" she asked. Samuel looked up at her, shading his eyes against the dying light. "The white ones, ma'am. They smell the sweetest." Margaret smiled, and for a moment the careful distance between them seemed to dissolve. "I've always preferred the red ones myself. They're more passionate." The word hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that Samuel didn't dare acknowledge. He nodded quickly and gathered his tools, but as he walked away he could feel her eyes following him until he disappeared around the corner of the house. That night, Samuel lay awake, thinking about the conversation, about the way Margaret had said the word passionate, about the look in her eyes. He knew he was walking into dangerous territory, but he felt powerless to stop himself from being drawn into whatever web was being woven around him. The summer heat seemed to intensify the strange atmosphere that had settled over the plantation. Judge Whitmore was often away on legal business, traveling to Atlanta or Savannah for court cases that could last for weeks. During these absences, Margaret seemed to grow more restless, more likely to appear wherever Samuel happened to be working. It was during one of these periods, in early September, that the first real conversation between them took place. Samuel had been sent to the library again, this time to dust the higher shelves that could only be reached with a ladder. As he worked, Margaret entered with a book in her hands. "I hope I'm not disturbing your work," she said, settling into one of the leather chairs near the window. "No, ma'am, I'll be quiet." "Actually," she said, opening her book, "I was hoping you might help me with something. I'm trying to reach a volume on the top shelf, but I'm afraid I'm not tall enough even with the step stool." Samuel climbed down from his ladder and approached the shelf she indicated. "Which book, ma'am?" "The red leather one, there in the corner. It's a collection of Shakespeare's sonnets." As Samuel reached for the book, Margaret moved closer, ostensibly to point out the exact volume she wanted. Her proximity made him acutely aware of her perfume, a delicate scent of jasmine and rose that seemed to envelop him. "This one?" he asked, his voice slightly hoarse. "Yes, that's perfect." As he handed her the book, their fingers brushed, and Samuel felt an electric shock run through him. Margaret didn't pull away immediately, and for a moment they stood frozen, the book suspended between them. "Thank you," she whispered, her green eyes looking directly into his for the first time. Samuel felt as though he was drowning in those eyes, in the warmth and loneliness he saw there. Every instinct told him to step away, to return to his work, to maintain the safe distance that kept enslaved people alive. But he found himself unable to move, caught in a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. "Ma'am," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "Margaret," she corrected softly. "When we're alone, you can call me Margaret." The use of her first name felt like crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. Samuel knew he should refuse, should maintain the proper forms of address that kept the world in its ordained order. But something in her voice, a vulnerability that matched his own, made him nod. "Margaret," he repeated, and the name felt strange and wonderful on his tongue. She smiled then, a real smile that transformed her entire face. "Would you like to hear one of the sonnets?" Shakespeare understood the human heart better than anyone. Samuel knew he should say no, should finish his work and leave, but he found himself nodding, drawn by the promise of beauty and the dangerous intimacy of the moment. Margaret opened the book and began to read, her voice soft and melodious. "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate." As she read, Samuel found himself studying her face, the way her lips formed the words, the gentle rise and fall of her chest as she breathed. He had never been this close to a white woman before, had never been allowed to see one as simply human, rather than as an untouchable symbol of power and privilege. When she finished the sonnet, there was silence between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts and dangerous possibilities. "It's beautiful," Samuel said finally. "Yes," Margaret agreed, but she was looking at him rather than the book. Beauty can be found in the most unexpected places. The moment was broken by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Margaret quickly stepped away, and Samuel returned to his ladder, both of them resuming their proper roles just as one of the house servants entered to announce that dinner was ready. As Samuel continued his work, he could feel the weight of what had just passed between them. He knew that he was playing with fire, that the consequences of whatever was developing between him and Margaret could be catastrophic. But he also knew that he was already too far down this path to turn back. The autumn days grew shorter, and with them, the opportunities for these stolen moments became more precious and more dangerous. Judge Whitmore's absences continued, and during these times, Margaret seemed to seek out Samuel's company with increasing frequency. Their conversations grew longer and more intimate. Margaret would ask about his life, his thoughts, his dreams. She seemed genuinely interested in his answers, treating him as a person rather than property. In return, Samuel found himself sharing things he had never told anyone, his memories of his mother, his secret ability to read, his longing for freedom. "If you could go anywhere in the world," Margaret asked one afternoon as they sat in the garden, "where would you go?" Samuel considered the question carefully. "North," he said finally. "I've heard there are places where a man can be free, where the color of his skin doesn't determine his fate." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "I've read about such places, cities where people of all backgrounds live and work together. It sounds wonderful." "What about you?" Samuel asked, then immediately regretted the question. It was too familiar, too presumptuous. But Margaret didn't seem offended. "I think I'd like to see Paris," she said dreamily. "I've read so much about it. The art, the literature, the freedom of thought. Sometimes I feel like I'm suffocating here, surrounded by all these rules and expectations." Samuel understood that feeling all too well, though he knew his cage was far more literal than hers. Still, in that moment, he felt a connection to her that transcended the vast differences in their circumstances. As October arrived, bringing with it the first hints of cooler weather, Samuel began to notice changes in Margaret's behavior. She seemed more restless, more prone to long silences during their conversations. Sometimes he would catch her looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, longing mixed with fear, desire tempered by the knowledge of impossibility. It was during this time that Judge Whitmore announced he would be traveling to Charleston for an extended legal proceeding that could last several weeks. The news sent a ripple of tension through the plantation, though Samuel couldn't understand why until he saw the look that passed between Margaret and her husband at dinner. "I do wish you didn't have to go," Margaret said, her voice carefully neutral. "Business is business, my dear," the judge replied curtly. "The plantation will run itself, and you have the servants to attend to your needs. I trust you'll find ways to occupy your time." There was something in his tone that suggested he knew exactly how she had been occupying her time, and Samuel felt a chill of fear run down his spine. But when he looked at Margaret, she appeared calm and composed, giving no sign that she understood any hidden meaning in her husband's words. The judge left on a Monday morning in late October, his carriage disappearing down the long drive in a cloud of dust. Samuel watched from the fields, a sense of foreboding settling over him like a dark cloud. He knew that with the judge gone, whatever had been building between him and Margaret would either come to a head or be forced to end forever. That evening, as Samuel finished his work in the stables, one of the house servants approached him. "Mrs. Whitmore wants to see you in the library," the woman said, her eyes avoiding his. "She says there's some repair work that needs doing." Samuel's heart began to race. He knew there was no repair work in the library. He had been there just days before and everything was in perfect condition. This was something else entirely, and they both knew it. As he walked toward the main house, Samuel felt as though he was walking toward his destiny, whatever that might be. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of red and gold, and somewhere in the distance, he could hear the mournful call of a whippoorwill. He paused at the library door, his hand raised to knock, knowing that whatever happened next would change everything forever. Samuel's knuckles barely grazed the library door before Margaret's voice called softly from within. "Come in." He entered to find her standing by the window, silhouetted against the dying light. She had changed from her usual day dress into something simpler, a white cotton gown that made her look younger, more vulnerable. Her auburn hair was loose around her shoulders instead of pinned up in its usual elaborate style. "You wanted to see me, Ma'am?" Samuel asked, though his voice caught slightly on the formal address. Margaret turned from the window, and Samuel could see that her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I asked you to call me Margaret when we're alone," she said softly. "Margaret," he corrected, the name feeling both natural and dangerous on his lips. She moved closer to him, and Samuel could see the conflict playing out across her features. Desire warring with propriety, longing fighting against the knowledge of consequences. "My husband will be gone for 3 weeks, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. 3 weeks of this terrible silence, this emptiness. Samuel felt his heart hammering against his ribs. He knew he should leave, should make some excuse, and flee to the safety of his quarters. But Margaret's pain was so evident, so raw, that he found himself stepping closer instead of backing away. "You don't have to be alone, Misa," he said, the words escaping before he could stop them. Margaret's breath caught, and for a moment they stood frozen, the weight of his words hanging between them like a bridge neither could cross safely. "Samuel," she whispered, and his name on her lips sounded like a prayer and a curse combined. "I know this is wrong," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I know what could happen to both of us, but I can't stop thinking about you, about these moments we share. You make me feel like I'm more than just property," Margaret finished for him. "I know. You make me feel like I'm more than just an ornament, more than just a pretty thing to display at dinner parties." They were standing so close now that Samuel could feel the warmth radiating from her skin, could smell the jasmine in her hair. Every rational thought in his head screamed at him to step away, but his body seemed to have a will of its own. "This is madness," Margaret said, but even as she spoke, her hand reached out to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw with infinite gentleness. Samuel closed his eyes at her touch, feeling as though he might collapse from the intensity of the sensation. No one had touched him with such tenderness since his mother's death. In Margaret's touch he felt seen, valued, human. "I've been so lonely," Margaret continued, her voice breaking slightly. "So terribly lonely. Cornelia sees me as a possession, something to be displayed and controlled. But you listen to me. You see me." Samuel opened his eyes and looked into hers, seeing his own longing reflected there. "I see you," he confirmed. "I see how intelligent you are, how kind. I see the sadness you try to hide and the strength you don't even know you have." Margaret's eyes filled with tears at his words. "No one has ever spoken to me like that," she whispered. "No one has ever seen me as you do." The space between them seemed to disappear without either of them moving. Samuel could feel Margaret's breath on his face, could see the pulse beating rapidly in her throat. Time seemed suspended, the world outside the library forgotten. "If we do this," Samuel said, his voice hoarse with emotion, "there's no going back. You know what they'll do to me if we're discovered." Margaret's face crumpled with pain. "I know," she said. "God help me, I know. But I can't bear this emptiness anymore. I can't pretend that what I feel for you doesn't exist." Samuel reached up and cupped her face in his hands, marveling at the softness of her skin. "Then don't pretend," he said. "Not tonight." What followed was a night that would haunt Samuel for the rest of his life, not because it was wrong, but because it was the only time he had ever felt truly alive. In Margaret's arms, he discovered a tenderness and passion he had never imagined possible. She touched him as though he were precious, as though he mattered, and for those stolen hours, the brutal realities of their world ceased to exist. They talked through the night, sharing stories and dreams, fears and hopes. Margaret told him about her childhood in Charleston, about the books that had shaped her mind and the music that moved her soul. Samuel shared his memories of his mother, his secret education, his dreams of freedom. "I wish we could run away together," Margaret said as dawn began to creep through the windows. "I wish we could go to one of those northern cities you talked about, where we could just be Samuel and Margaret, not master and slave." Samuel held her close, knowing that such dreams were impossible, but unable to resist imagining them for just a moment. "In another life," he said softly, "in another world, maybe we could have been happy together." As the sun rose, reality began to intrude once again. Margaret had to return to her role as the judge's wife, and Samuel had to become invisible once more. But something fundamental had changed between them, something that could never be undone. The next few weeks passed in a haze of stolen moments and desperate longing. Whenever possible, Margaret would find excuses to be alone with Samuel. Repairs that needed doing, books that needed moving, gardens that required tending. Their physical relationship deepened, but so did their emotional connection. Samuel found himself living for these moments, counting the hours until he could see Margaret again, hold her again, pretend for a little while that they were just two people in love, rather than participants in a relationship that could destroy them both. Margaret seemed transformed by their affair. The sadness that had always shadowed her eyes was replaced by a glow that made her more beautiful than ever. She smiled more, laughed more, and seemed to move through her days with a lightness that hadn't been there before. But Samuel also began to notice troubling signs. Margaret was becoming careless, allowing their conversations to go on too long in places where they might be overheard. She would look at him during meals when other servants were present, her eyes soft with affection that anyone might notice. "We have to be more careful," Samuel warned her one afternoon as they lay together in the library. "People are starting to notice." Margaret traced patterns on his chest with her finger, seemingly unconcerned. "Let them notice," she said dreamily. "I'm tired of hiding, tired of pretending." Samuel caught her hand, stilling its movement. "Margaret, you don't understand what will happen if we're discovered. They won't just punish me, they'll kill me and you. Your life will be ruined." Margaret's eyes flashed with defiance. "My life is already ruined," she said. "I'm trapped in a loveless marriage to a man who sees me as property. At least with you I feel alive." Samuel understood her feelings, but he also understood the realities of their situation in ways that Margaret, protected by her privilege, could not fully grasp. He had seen what happened to enslaved people who crossed the lines that white society had drawn. He had seen the bodies hanging from trees, the broken men who had been made examples of. But Margaret's recklessness was intoxicating, and despite his fears, Samuel found himself swept along by her passion and her certainty that their love could somehow transcend the brutal realities of their world. It was in early November that Margaret first mentioned the possibility that she might be pregnant. She said it casually, almost as an afterthought, but Samuel felt the words hit him like a physical blow. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Margaret looked up at him with eyes that were bright with a mixture of joy and terror. "I said I might be carrying your child." Samuel felt the world tilt around him. A child. Their child. The implications crashed over him in waves. The impossibility of the situation. The danger to all three of them. The certain destruction that would follow discovery. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Not yet," Margaret admitted. "But I'm late and I've been feeling different." "Samuel, what if I am? What will we do?" Samuel pulled away from her, running his hands through his hair as he tried to think. A pregnant white woman carrying the child of an enslaved man. It was a scenario that could only end in tragedy. "We'll figure something out," he said, though he had no idea what that might be. "Maybe. Maybe you could say it's the judge's child." Margaret shook her head. "Cornelius and I haven't. We haven't been intimate in months. He would know it wasn't his." The weight of their situation settled over Samuel like a suffocating blanket. There was no way out, no solution that didn't end in disaster for all of them. "Maybe you're not pregnant," he said desperately. "Maybe it's just stress or—" But even as he spoke, Samuel could see in Margaret's eyes that she knew the truth. She was carrying his child, and that child would be the evidence that condemned them both. Over the next few days, Margaret's pregnancy became undeniable. She was sick in the mornings, tired in the afternoons, and her body began to show the subtle changes that confirmed their worst fears. "I'm scared," she admitted to Samuel one evening as they sat together in the garden. "I'm terrified of what Cornelius will do when he finds out." Samuel took her hands in his, feeling their trembling. "We'll protect the baby," he promised, though he had no idea how. "Whatever happens, we'll make sure our child is safe." Margaret looked at him with tears in her eyes. "Our child," she repeated. "I never thought I would have a child born of love rather than duty." Despite the terror of their situation, Samuel felt a fierce pride and protectiveness surge through him. This child, conceived in love and tenderness, would be a part of both of them. Whatever happened, that could never be taken away. But their time was running out. Judge Whitmore was due to return from Charleston within the week, and Margaret's condition would soon become impossible to hide. "We could run away," Margaret said suddenly one night as they lay together. "We could leave tonight, head north, start a new life somewhere." Samuel wanted desperately to say yes, to believe that such an escape was possible, but he knew the realities of their world too well. "They would find us," he said gently. "Your husband has connections everywhere, and a pregnant white woman traveling with a black man. We wouldn't make it 50 miles. Margaret began to cry then, great sobbing tears that broke Samuel's heart. He held her close, whispering words of comfort that felt hollow even to him. "I love you," she said through her tears. "Whatever happens, I want you to know that I love you more than I've ever loved anyone." "I love you too," Samuel replied, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. "I love you and I love our child. That will never change no matter what comes next." As Judge Whitmore's return drew closer, both Samuel and Margaret became increasingly desperate. They knew that discovery was inevitable. Margaret's pregnancy would soon be obvious, and the judge was not a stupid man. He would count the months and realize that the child could not be his. It was Margaret who came up with the plan that would ultimately seal Samuel's fate. "I'll tell him I was attacked," she said one night, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "I'll say it was someone from outside the plantation, a stranger who forced himself on me." Samuel stared at her in horror. "Margaret, no. You can't lie about something like that." "It's the only way to protect you," she insisted. "If I say it was a stranger, they'll look for someone who doesn't exist. You'll be safe." But Samuel knew better. He knew that when white women claimed to have been attacked by black men, the white community didn't always wait for evidence before seeking vengeance. Any black man in the area could become a target, and Samuel couldn't bear the thought of innocent people suffering for his actions. "I won't let you do that," he said firmly. "I won't let others pay for what we chose to do." Margaret looked at him with desperate eyes. "Then what do you suggest? Because Cornelius will be home in 3 days, and when he sees that I'm pregnant, he'll know it's not his child. What do you think he'll do then?" Samuel had no answer. Every option led to disaster. Every path ended in destruction. They were trapped by the very society that had brought them together, caught in a web of laws and customs that made their love not just forbidden, but deadly. As they held each other that night, both knowing it might be their last time together, Samuel tried to memorize every detail. The feel of Margaret's skin against his, the sound of her breathing, the way she fit perfectly in his arms. Whatever came next, he would carry these memories with him always. The next morning brought news that would change everything. Judge Whitmore had finished his business in Charleston early and would be returning that very afternoon. Margaret received the news with a calm that frightened Samuel more than tears would have. She seemed to have made some internal decision, reached some conclusion that she wasn't sharing with him. "Margaret," he said when they had a moment alone, "what are you thinking?" She looked at him with eyes that seemed older than her years. "I'm thinking that I've been living in a dream," she said quietly, "and now it's time to wake up." That afternoon, as Judge Whitmore's carriage rolled up the drive, Samuel watched from the fields with a sense of impending doom. The judge looked the same as always, tall, imposing, radiating authority and control, but there was something in his bearing that suggested he already knew what he would find waiting for him. That evening, Samuel lay in his bunk listening to the sounds of the plantation settling into night. Somewhere in the big house, Margaret was facing her husband, and Samuel could only imagine what was being said between them. He didn't have to wait long to find out. Just after midnight, the door to the slave quarters burst open, and Judge Whitmore strode in, flanked by two of his overseers. In the flickering light of their torches, the judge's face was a mask of cold fury. "Samuel," he said, his voice cutting through the darkness like a blade. "Get up." Samuel rose slowly from his bunk, his heart hammering but his face carefully blank. Around him, the other enslaved people pretended to sleep, knowing that witnessing this scene could bring punishment down on their own heads. "You're coming with us," Judge Whitmore continued. "There are some questions that need answering." As Samuel was led from the quarters, he caught a glimpse of the main house. In an upstairs window he could see a figure silhouetted against the light, Margaret, watching as he was taken away. Even from that distance, even in the darkness, Samuel could feel her eyes on him. And in that moment he understood that whatever she had told her husband, whatever story she had constructed to explain her pregnancy, it had not been enough to save him. The last thing Samuel saw before he was pushed into the waiting wagon was Margaret's figure disappearing from the window, and he knew with terrible certainty that he would never see her again. The interrogation room in the basement of the courthouse was a place designed to break spirits. Stone walls sweated with moisture, and the single oil lamp cast dancing shadows that seemed to mock anyone unfortunate enough to find themselves there. Samuel had been chained to a wooden chair for 3 hours, his wrists raw from the iron shackles, when Judge Whitmore finally entered. The judge was not alone. Behind him came Sheriff Morrison, a thick-set man with cruel eyes and hands that bore the scars of violence, and Dr. Henley, the county physician whose presence suggested this interrogation would be thorough and scientific. "Samuel," Judge Whitmore began, his voice deceptively calm as he settled into a chair across from the shackled young man, "I'm going to give you one opportunity to tell me the truth. What happened between you and my wife?" Samuel kept his eyes fixed on the floor, knowing that meeting the judge's gaze would only fuel his rage. "Nothing happened, sir. I don't know what you mean." The backhanded blow came so fast that Samuel's head snapped to the side, his ear ringing from the impact. Sheriff Morrison flexed his fingers, preparing for another strike. "Let's try again," Judge Whitmore said, his tone never changing. "My wife is pregnant with a child that is not mine. She claims she was attacked by a stranger, but we both know that's impossible. This plantation is too well guarded, too isolated, so I'll ask you again. What happened?" Samuel's mind raced. If Margaret had claimed it was a stranger, she was trying to protect him. But he could see in the judge's eyes that the man already knew the truth, or at least suspected it strongly enough to act. "I don't know anything about Mrs. Whitmore being pregnant, sir," Samuel said, tasting blood from his split lip. "I only see her when I'm doing work around the house." This time it was Sheriff Morrison who spoke. "Boy, we found something interesting in your quarters." He held up a small piece of fabric, white cotton with delicate lace trim. Samuel's heart sank as he recognized it as part of a handkerchief Margaret had given him weeks ago. "This belongs to Mrs. Whitmore," the sheriff continued. "Want to explain how it ended up under your mattress?" Samuel's mouth went dry. He had kept the handkerchief as a token, something to remember their time together by. Now it would be used as evidence against him. I found it in the garden," he said desperately. "I was going to return it, but I forgot." Judge Whitmore laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth. "You forgot to return my wife's personal belongings. How convenient." He leaned forward, his cold blue eyes boring into Samuel's. "Let me tell you what I think happened. I think you've been taking liberties with my wife. I think you seduced her, took advantage of her gentle nature and loneliness, and I think you got her pregnant." "No, sir," Samuel said, though his voice lacked conviction. "I would never—" "Never what?" Judge Whitmore interrupted. "Never touch a white woman, never forget your place? Because that's exactly what you did, isn't it?" Dr. Henley, who had been silent until now, stepped forward with his medical bag. "Judge, if you'd like me to examine the boy, I can determine if he's been active recently." Samuel's stomach churned at the implication. The humiliation of such an examination would be almost as bad as the physical pain they were inflicting. "That won't be necessary, Doctor," Judge Whitmore said, never taking his eyes off Samuel. I can see the guilt written all over his face. The interrogation continued for hours. They asked the same questions over and over, trying to break Samuel's resolve through repetition and exhaustion. They described in graphic detail what they would do to him if he confessed, and what they would do if he continued to lie. Through it all, Samuel maintained his innocence, though each denial became harder to voice. His body ached from the beatings, his throat was raw from thirst, and his spirit was beginning to crack under the relentless pressure. It was near dawn when Judge Whitmore finally changed tactics. "You know, Samuel," he said conversationally as if they were discussing the weather, "I've been thinking about your mother. Sarah, wasn't it? I remember when she died. Pneumonia, the doctor said, but I always wondered if there might have been more to it." Samuel's head snapped up, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "What do you mean?" Judge Whitmore smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression Samuel had ever seen. "I mean that your mother was a beautiful woman, and beautiful slave women sometimes attract attention from their masters. I wonder what she might have had to endure before she died." The implication hit Samuel like a physical blow. The suggestion that his mother might have been violated, might have suffered in ways he had never imagined, filled him with a rage so pure and hot that it threatened to consume him. "How you leave her out of this?" Samuel snarled, straining against his chains. "Ah," Judge Whitmore said with satisfaction, "there's the fire I was looking for. You see, Sheriff, he does have passion in him, the kind of passion that might lead a man to forget his place." Samuel realized too late that he had been manipulated, that his reaction had been exactly what the judge was looking for. By showing emotion, by defending his mother's memory, he had revealed that he was capable of the kind of feelings that could lead to the relationship they suspected. "Now," Judge Whitmore continued, "let's talk about what really happened with my wife." But Samuel had reached his breaking point. The combination of physical pain, emotional torture, and the violation of his mother's memory had pushed him beyond the ability to think clearly. "Yes," he said, the word torn from his throat like a confession at gunpoint. "Yes, I was with her, but it wasn't what you think. She was lonely, and I cared about her. We cared about each other." The silence that followed his admission was deafening. Judge Whitmore sat back in his chair, his face a mask of cold satisfaction, while Sheriff Morrison cracked his knuckles in anticipation. "Go on," the judge said quietly, and Samuel, his defenses finally shattered, told them everything. He told them about the conversations in the library, about Margaret's loneliness and intelligence, about the way she had seen him as a person rather than property. He told them about the poetry and the stolen moments, about the growing connection that had blossomed into love. What he didn't tell them was that it had been mutual, that Margaret had been as much a participant as he had been. Instead, he painted himself as the seducer, the one who had taken advantage of her kindness and vulnerability. "She never wanted any of this," he lied, the words cutting him like knives. I I forced myself on her. She tried to resist, but I was stronger. I'm the one who's responsible for everything." Judge Whitmore listened to this fabricated confession with growing satisfaction. This was the story he needed, the narrative that would preserve his wife's reputation while justifying the punishment he planned to inflict. "And the pregnancy?" he asked. "That's my fault too," Samuel said, each word feeling like a betrayal of everything he and Margaret had shared. I didn't stop when she begged me to. I kept going back, kept forcing myself on her. The baby is mine." When Samuel finished his false confession, the room fell silent except for the sound of his own ragged breathing. He had just signed his own death warrant, but he told himself it was worth it if it protected Margaret and their child. Judge Whitmore stood slowly, his face a study in controlled fury. "Sheriff Morrison, I want this animal locked up in solitary confinement. No visitors, no contact with the outside world. He's going to have a long time to think about what he's done." "What about a trial?" "Doctor," Henley asked. Judge Whitmore's smile was cold as winter. "What trial? He just confessed to raping my wife. In this county, that's all the trial we need." As Samuel was dragged from the interrogation room, his mind was already beginning to fracture under the weight of what he had done. He had saved Margaret by destroying himself, but the cost was almost more than he could bear. The cell they threw him into was a stone box barely large enough for a man to lie down in. There was no window, no light except for the thin beam that crept under the door during daylight hours. The walls wept with moisture, and the floor was covered with moldy straw that hadn't been changed in months. In that darkness, Samuel began the long journey into madness that would define the next 5 years of his life. Days blended into nights, with no way to mark the passage of time. Food came irregularly, sometimes a bowl of thin gruel, sometimes nothing at all. Water was provided in a rusty bucket that Samuel had to ration carefully, never knowing when it would be refilled. But the physical deprivation was nothing compared to the mental torture. In the endless darkness, Samuel's mind began to play tricks on him. He heard Margaret's voice calling his name, felt her touch on his skin, smelled her jasmine perfume in the fetid air of his cell. Sometimes he would have entire conversations with her, explaining why he had lied, why he had painted himself as a monster to protect her. Other times he would rage at her for being careless, for not understanding the danger they were in. "You should have been more careful," he would whisper to the darkness. "You should have known this would happen." But then he would remember her tears, her fear, her desperate love for him and their unborn child, and his anger would dissolve into grief so profound it felt like drowning. Weeks passed, or maybe months. Samuel had no way of knowing. His body began to waste away from the poor food and lack of exercise. His hair grew long and matted. His beard became a tangled mess. His clothes never changed, rotted on his body until they were little more than rags. But it was his mind that suffered the most. The isolation, the darkness, the constant uncertainty about Margaret and their child, it all combined to create a psychological pressure that would have broken a weaker man completely. Samuel survived by retreating into memories. He would spend hours reliving every moment he had shared with Margaret, every conversation, every touch, every stolen kiss. He would imagine their child growing up, wonder if it was a boy or girl, dream about the life they might have had in a different world. Sometimes, in his darkest moments, he would wonder if Margaret even remembered him. Had she moved on, convinced herself that their love had been nothing more than a temporary madness? Had she told herself that he really was the monster he had confessed to being? The uncertainty was almost worse than the physical suffering. Not knowing whether Margaret was safe, whether their child had been born healthy, whether his sacrifice had meant anything at all, these questions gnawed at him like physical pain. It was during his 2nd year in solitary confinement that Samuel began to hear the voices. At first, they were whispers at the edge of his consciousness, easily dismissed as products of his deteriorating mental state. But gradually, they became clearer, more insistent. Sometimes, it was his mother's voice, telling him to be strong, to survive. Sometimes it was Margaret, begging him to hold on, promising that their love had been real and meaningful. And sometimes it was the voice of their child, a voice he had never heard but somehow recognized, calling him father, and asking why he had abandoned them. These auditory hallucinations became Samuel's companions in the endless darkness. He would have long conversations with these phantom voices, finding in them the human connection that had been stripped away from him. "I didn't abandon you," he would whisper to his imaginary child. "I saved your mother. I saved both of you." But even as he spoke these words, Samuel began to doubt their truth. Had his confession really protected Margaret? Or had it simply given Judge Whitmore the excuse he needed to destroy them all? As his third year in solitary began, Samuel's grip on reality became increasingly tenuous. He would sometimes forget where he was, believing himself to be back in the fields of Whitmore Plantation or in the library with Margaret. These episodes of dissociation provided temporary relief from his suffering, but they also marked his steady descent into madness. It was during one of these episodes that Samuel first began to see the light. It started as a faint glow in the corner of his cell, barely visible even in the absolute darkness. At first he thought it was another hallucination, another product of his deteriorating mind, but the light persisted, growing stronger over the days and weeks that followed. It seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, like a heartbeat made visible. And in that light Samuel began to see shapes, figures that moved and gestured, as if trying to communicate with him. "Margaret," he would whisper to the light, "is that you?" The light would pulse brighter, and Samuel would take that as confirmation. In his fractured mind, the light became a connection to the world outside his cell, a lifeline to the love he had lost. By his fourth year in confinement, Samuel had constructed an entire mythology around the light. He believed it was Margaret's spirit, visiting him to let him know that she was safe, that their child was growing up healthy and strong. He would spend hours talking to the light, telling it about his dreams and fears, his regrets and hopes. The guards who brought his food began to notice his behavior, the way he would gesture and speak to empty air. They reported back to Judge Whitmore that the prisoner was losing his mind, becoming a babbling madman who posed no threat to anyone. This was exactly what the judge had hoped for. A dead Samuel would have been a martyr, a symbol of injustice that might have inspired others to rebellion. But a mad Samuel, broken and incoherent, served as a perfect example of what happened to those who forgot their place. As his fifth year in solitary confinement began, Samuel had become a shadow of his former self. His body was skeletal, his hair and beard wild and unkempt, his eyes holding the distant look of someone who had seen too much darkness. But somewhere deep inside, in a part of his mind that the isolation hadn't been able to touch, Samuel held on to one unshakable truth. He had loved Margaret Whitmore, and she had loved him. Their child, wherever it was, had been conceived in love rather than violence. That truth, fragile as it was, became the foundation that kept him from complete madness. No matter what lies he had told, no matter what false confessions he had made, the love he and Margaret had shared had been real. And as long as he remembered that love, as long as he held on to that one pure thing in a world full of darkness and cruelty, Samuel knew he could survive whatever came next. The light in his cell pulsed brighter, and Samuel smiled for the first time in years. "I remember," he whispered to the darkness. "I remember everything." 5 years. 1,825 days of darkness, silence, and the slow erosion of everything that had once made Samuel human. As he sat in his stone cell, on what he didn't know was the anniversary of his imprisonment, Samuel had become something between man and ghost, a living reminder of what happened when the established order was challenged. His 23rd birthday had passed unmarked in the darkness, along with countless other milestones that free men took for granted. His body bore the evidence of his confinement, ribs visible through paper-thin skin, hair grown wild and white before its time, hands that trembled from malnutrition, and the constant cold that seeped through the stone walls. But it was his mind that had paid the heaviest price. The Samuel who had once read poetry by candlelight and dreamed of freedom had been replaced by a fractured consciousness that drifted between memory and hallucination, between the brutal present and a past that seemed more real than the stone walls around him. On this particular morning, though morning and night had long since lost their meaning in the perpetual darkness, Samuel was visited by his most frequent companion, the memory of Margaret reading Shakespeare in the library. Her voice soft and melodious, as she brought the words to life. "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" the phantom Margaret recited, and Samuel's lips moved along with words he had memorized during those precious stolen moments. "Thou art more lovely and more temperate." The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside his cell shattered the illusion. Samuel's head snapped up, his heart racing with a mixture of hope and terror. Visitors were rare, usually only the guards who brought his meager rations or the occasional inspection by officials who wanted to see the dangerous criminal for themselves. But these footsteps were different. They moved with purpose, accompanied by voices that Samuel strained to hear through the thick wooden door. "I've been down here for 5 years, one voice was saying. "Judge says he's completely mad now, no threat to anyone." "Still," came another voice, younger and less certain, "keeping a man in solitary for this long, it doesn't seem right." Samuel pressed his ear to the door, his heart hammering as he tried to make sense of what he was hearing. Were they talking about releasing him? Had someone finally questioned the justice of his punishment? The footsteps stopped outside his cell, and Samuel heard the scrape of metal against metal as someone worked the lock. Light flooded in as the door opened, and Samuel threw his hands up to shield his eyes, which had grown accustomed to near-total darkness. "Jesus Christ," the younger voice breathed. "Look at him." Through his fingers, Samuel could make out 2 figures silhouetted in the doorway. One was Sheriff Morrison, older now and heavier, but still radiating the same casual cruelty that Samuel remembered. The other was a younger man in a deputy's uniform, his face pale with shock at what he was seeing. "Samuel," Sheriff Morrison said, his voice carrying a note of mock concern, "how are you feeling today?" Samuel tried to speak, but his voice came out as little more than a croak. He hadn't used it for conversation in months, and the words felt foreign on his tongue. I'm, he began, then stopped, unsure of what he was trying to say. "He's lost his mind completely," Sheriff Morrison explained to his companion. "Talks to himself, sees things that aren't there. Judge Whitmore was right to keep him locked up." The younger deputy stepped closer, and Samuel could see the mixture of pity and revulsion in his eyes. "What did he do to deserve this?" "Raped the judge's wife," Sheriff Morrison said matter-of-factly. "Got her pregnant, confessed to the whole thing. Lucky we didn't just string him up from the nearest tree." Samuel wanted to protest, to explain that it hadn't been rape, that Margaret had loved him as he had loved her, but the words wouldn't come. 5 years of isolation had stolen his ability to defend himself, to articulate the truth that burned in his chest like a coal. "Anyway," Sheriff Morrison continued, "we're moving him today. Judge has decided it's time for a change of scenery." Samuel's heart leaped with desperate hope. Were they finally releasing him? Had his punishment been deemed sufficient? But as the guards shackled his wrists and ankles, Samuel realized that this was not freedom. The chains were too heavy, the guards too numerous. This was simply a transfer from one prison to another. As they led him from the cell that had been his world for 5 years, Samuel caught his first glimpse of sunlight in what felt like a lifetime. The sensation was overwhelming, the warmth on his skin, the brightness that made his eyes water, the simple miracle of seeing the sky again. The courthouse looked exactly as he remembered it, a monument to white authority and justice that had never been intended for people like him. But there were changes too. New buildings, different faces, signs of a world that had continued to turn while he had been buried alive in his stone tomb. They loaded him into a wagon, and as it began to move, Samuel caught sight of something that made his heart stop. There, walking down the main street of town, was a woman with auburn hair and a small child by her side. For a moment, Samuel's damaged mind convinced him that it was Margaret, that she had somehow found him and come to rescue him from his nightmare. He strained against his chains, trying to get a better look, his voice finally finding strength. "Margaret," he called out, his voice raw and desperate. But as the wagon drew closer,